Thank you so much, Shira. Thank you to Malka and Elliot Spiegel for sponsoring today. And thank you to Torah in Motion for putting together this opportunity for all of us to do this learning together. It's been a pleasure to study with you over these past weeks. And today we arrive at our grand finale, where I hope we'll have the opportunity to answer or at least address the $64,000 question. How is it that this book called the Shulhan Arukh became the authoritative code of Jewish law for the last several hundred years? I'll just begin with the first source that you have on your source sheet, because it states sort of unequivocally that that this is in fact the case. The excerpt comes from Tzvi Wrblowski, Joseph Karo, lawyer and mystic, one of the early attempts to create a biography of Rabbi Yosef Karo, and he writes the social impact of the Shulchan Aruch was unprecedented. Its reception by Jews everywhere meant that for all ordinary purposes, one and the same manual was the de facto standard of reference. Even more, the Shulchan Aruch came to represent the summa of Jewish life. It was the valid formulation of practical Judaism that henceforth dominated Israel. Few literary documents apart from the Bible, the Talmud, and perhaps the prayer book have acquired such immense practical and symbolic social value in Jewish history. And I would just add that even 500 years later, remember the Beis Yosef Yosef Karo began writing his Beis Yosef, the precursor to the Shulchan Aruch, in 1522. So this is a 500-year-old story, and 500 years later, we still feel the impact of this book called the Shulchan Aruch. Every halachic conversation begins with the Shulchan Aruch. It involves the Shulchan Aruch. It wields such enormous influence over the halachic process. And I wanted to try to unpack the question of how this came to be the state of affairs. So let me begin by saying that the opening reception to the Shulchan Aruch, let's say in the 16th century and thereafter, was mixed, as we'll circle back to in a few moments, and it's going to be quite important. The Rama, as we talked a little bit about last week, accepted the Shulchan Aruch as the basis for his glosses. He wrote his own book on the tour called the Darkei Moshe, but when it came to the Shulchan Aruch, it was that book to which the Rama, the Rav Moshe Israelis, appended his glosses, and that was very important. Many others in the 16th century, the second half of the 16th century, openly and warmly welcomed the Shulchan Aruch. It's important to note historically that it was reprinted numerous times within the lifetime of the author, which was virtually unheard of, and it became an international bestseller. But many of Rabbi Yosef Karo's contemporaries and successors were not as warm to the idea of the Shulchan Aruch as those who embraced it. So I want to just share with you, by way of introduction, the reaction of a few of his contemporaries and successors, a list of Gedolei Torah, prominent rabbis in the Jewish world who vehemently opposed the notion of a Shulchan Aruch. And I begin with the Maharshal, Rabbi Solomon Luria. Rabbi Solomon Luria was born in 1510s. That makes him about 25 years younger than the Shulchan Aruch, but he actually predeceased Rabbi Yosef Karo. Died at the age of 63 in 1573, almost an exact contemporary of the Rama, a little older than the Rama. They were actually related. And the Maharshal went on the attack against the printing of the Shulchan Aruch and against the notion that Jewish law could be codified in such a form, in such a way. And I'll share with you just one excerpt from the introduction to a book he wrote called the Yam Shel Shlomo. So Shlomo Luria writes in the introduction to his book. You have this in source number 2. He says in the bold, he says it can't be. Mitoch zeni tan lebal din lachlok v'lomar kim lekechad min hon hasfardi kesfardim hatzarfatim kitzfartim v'chol echad barer eshelo. This is what you've set up with the publication of this book, the Shulchan Aruch and the Rama, is, everyone is going to poskin for themselves based on their particular orientations. The Sephardim will have the Sephardic halacha, and the French will have the French halacha. B'chol echad borah shelo says v'im ve'am v'am kil shano, to borrow expression that's coming up in the Megillah. Everyone's going to have their own language of halacha. B'sovra Torah Yerusha Hilim Mishpachos, and it could just be broken up. Whatever the halacha is, the Ashkenazim have it their way, the Italians have it their way, because it can't be velo zu haderech velo zu ha'ir. You can't decide halachic practice on that basis. He says, if you want to understand what the halacha is, take a Gemara off the shelf, learn the sugya, understand the ins and outs of the machlokes as it appears in the Talmud. The Talmud has to be the basis for every part of the halachic discussion. And based on the question, based on the person asking the question, based on the circumstance, you'll learn through the sugya, you'll work through the discussion in the Talmud, and you'll arrive at the halachic conclusion. He says that part of the process is totally indispensable. And so the Maharshal, the Yamshal Shlomo, Reb Shlomo Luria, wrote an alternative to the Shulhan Aruch, except that his alternative was not a code of Jewish law, because he believed on a philosophical level, on a principle level, that codification was not valid. So you can't have a code of Jewish law. You can't have a book where you open up and you just say, oh, that's the halacha. No, to know the halacha, you have to pull the Talmud off the shelf and learn the halacha based on the sugya itself. And so his book is not a code at all, but rather a commentary on the Talmud with an eye toward the halachic process. Okay, the idea of codification for the Maharshal was problematic on its face. He held that it was a mistake to follow local practice. Rabbis need to decide halachic conclusions based on the Talmud. Okay, as you might imagine, because if you're sitting here saying, how can I never heard of the Yamshel Shlomo, the Maharshal, the Shlomo Lura, or if I heard of him, it's certainly less famous than, that's because he lost. He lost the battle, and he lost badly, right? So the Shulchan Aruch is being reproduced, countless times. How many times is the Maharshal being reproduced? How many people have it on their shelf versus the number of people who have in their homes a copy of the Shulchan Aruch? Right, it's night and day. The Maharshal was not practical, because your average person, even your average rabbi, was not in a position to just open up the Talmud and begin paskening halacha based on that fact. The ease of use of the Shulchan Aruch, right, far outweighed the principled fealty of the Yamshel Shlomo to the halachic discourse and a return to the Talmudic tradition. The Maharal of Prague, who's also a contemporary, is born in 1520 and lived a long life, died in 1609, also believed that in principle a person has to go back to the sources, and opposed this idea that the halacha could be codified in a singular book, in a single work. And he wrote, and I'll just summarize for you in source number 3, he says, it's not just that you're going to get the halacha wrong if you don't go back to the sources, you're going to disincentivize the study of the Talmud, because the Shulchan Aruch is the greatest shortcut that a student could possibly have. So first of all, to identify where the sugya is. And then, right, it's not just confined to one location. The sugya might start in brachos and then continue in psachim, and then you have to know that there's a tosfos in nazir. And what if I don't know that? So I'll just open up this beautifully organized, encyclopedic, didactic, apodictic work, and here it is, page 226, and there it is, one line. Just give me the maskana de milsa, the conclusion. I don't need the back and forth. Tell me what to do. I'm good to go. And the Maharal says, people are going to abandon Talmud study, and what will happen then? I'll share with you what I consider to be one of the kind of sadder chapters in the reception history of the Shulchan Aruch, and that's the story of a man called Mordechai Jaffe, the author of a monumental work called the Levush. And I say it's a kind of a sad story because there's just some mazel that didn't go the way of the Levush. Okay, the Levush was an Ashkenazic rabbi, born almost exactly the same year as the Ramah. They're almost exact contemporaries. Born in 1530, but he studied actually with both the Ramah and the Maharshal. And in 1550, as you know, the Beis Yosef appears. So the Levush, sees this Beis Yosef, and everyone is struck that this is an extraordinary, monumental, life-changing kind of work. And he says there's just one problem with the Beis Yosef, and that's that it's too long. So you remember we studied a couple weeks ago the Beis Yosef, which calls all the sources together and synthesizes them and then organizes them. It's amazing. Levush, like everyone knows, it's amazing, but he says it's too much. So let me try to consolidate what I have here. 1561, the Levush is living in Bohemia. The Jews are expelled from Bohemia, and he ends up moving to Venice. In 1564, it just so happens that the Shulhan Aruch appears and is published in Venice. Okay, so right in his backyard, and again, we remember this kind of story where the Ramah started working and he heard the Beis Yosef beat him to the punch and he fell off his chair because thought maybe all of his work would be for naught. And he had to recalculate and recalibrate and come up with a new way to organize his project. So this is a parallel story when it comes to the Levush, except that it happens to him twice. He publishes the publication of the Shulhan Aruch totally throws him for a loop, and his project to consolidate the Shulhan Aruch. Well, now the Yosef Karo did it himself. So you're writing the short version of the Beis Yosef, except that the author of the Beis Yosef wrote the short version of the Beis Yosef and called it the Shulhan Aruch, and now the Levush's project seems to have been for naught. Okay, so he puts down his pen, he stops working, he says, I'm not doing this anymore. But then he thinks, you know what? It's amazing. The Beis Yosef is so important. The Shulchan Aruch is so important, but we really need an Ashkenazic voice in here. The Ashkenazim aren't represented enough, so he starts to work on an Ashkenazic alternative to the Shulchan Aruch. And in 1571, he moves back to Poland, and wouldn't you know it, in 1578, the glosses of the Ramah are published once again in his backyard. And once again, the Levush has to throw up his arms and say, someone beat me to the punch, and my project is for naught. Finally, he hits on the idea of a middle ground. And he says, you have the Beis Yosef, which is totally inclusive. He quoted everything. And you have the Shulchan Aruch, where it's just the bottom line. He quoted nothing. He says, what would really be helpful? Something where you create a middle path. Like there's a middle road, there's a Shvil HaZahav, there's some kind of golden mean between everything of the Beis Yosef and just the conclusion of the Shulchan Aruch. How about we'll call it the Levush, and there'll be a middle, a little discussion, a consolidated discussion with a conclusion. And he undertakes this monumental work, published over the course of 15 years in 10 volumes. The idea being to synthesize and collate the Beis Yosef and the Shulchan Aruch. Okay, and again, it's an unsuccessful project. We have the Levush, people call on it, but it's too much. Meaning, if you want the whole thing, go to the Beis Yosef. If you want the bottom line, go to the Shulchan Aruch. Right? There actually wasn't, and the kind of market bore this out. There wasn't a market for something that just tried to create this middle ground, even though it was a lifelong project of the Levush, and is an amazing work that took over 50 years of the Levush's lifetime. Okay, so these are just a couple of highlights to give you a sense of the competition, right? To give you a sense that it wasn't as if, right, one could have imagined the answer to my opening question: how did the Shulchan Aruch become the authoritative code of Jewish law? Well, maybe it was just the first. Sometimes you have someone who comes up with an invention, and they're the first to market, and they scare away all the other competitors, and everyone puts down their projects and puts down their pens, and they say, okay, you're the first, so you win. So that wasn't quite the case, right? There actually was competition in the 16th century for, something beyond just the Tur or just the Rambam, whatever was extant, a voice and a desire for an alternative. The Shulchan Aruch creates one, the Ramah creates one, the Maharshal creates one, the Levush creates one, and towering above all of them is Rabbi Yosef Karo's Shulchan Aruch. So we have to sort of back into the question of how this happened and how this came about. Before we do, I'll just kind of wrap up this section of today's class by saying that even among those who did not create an alternative, there was nonetheless assertive opposition to the notion of the Shulchan Aruch. So I gave you the kind of most extreme examples, people who were so opposed to the Shulchan Aruch that they created alternatives, right? So people who put their money where their mouth is, so to speak. The Maharshal didn't just say, oh, that's a terrible idea, don't have a code. He said, that's a terrible idea, don't have a code. What you should have is a commentary to the Talmud that has an eye toward the halachic process and allows you to study the Talmud such that each person can reach a viable halachic conclusion. Okay, well, Levush said, don't do what the Shulchan Aruch did. That's too concise. We need something that actually gives you some more meat on the bone so that you don't just see a halacha in a vacuum. This is what to do, but a little bit of the rationale, the rhyme, the reason, the context. Here's what to do, and here's a little bit of the background for why we've reached this halachic conclusion. So there were people who wrote alternative works that could compete with the Shulchan Aruch. But putting aside those who wrote alternative works, were those who didn't have the wherewithal necessarily to write an alternative, but nonetheless opposed the Shulchan Aruch. I'll give you a couple examples. One is the Maharam Milublin, and you can see this. I'll just give you one excerpt in source number 6. The Maharam wrote the following. He says, Ein miminhagi umidarkai lios esek b'divrei balei Shulchan Aruch v'kal b'chomer livnos yesod be'ezah haral diktuk sodos divreihem. He says, I don't use it. I have contemporaries who do, but I don't use the Shulchan Aruch, and not to paskin, and I certainly don't use it to build up halachic arguments. It's not the foundation of any halachic discussion that I would have. Okay, ki lo nitnu miroeh echad, rak hem dvarim nilkatim mechubarim midvarim nilkatim nifradim. He says it's not a single source. If you want to say, okay, this is the Rambam, and now we're going to build a halachic, conversation on this foundation, that's perfectly legitimate. But the Shulchan Aruch is just an amalgam. It's a compilation, a little from the Rambam, and a little from the Rif, and a little from the Rush, and we can't deal with that. Okay, I'm not getting into it, but I'm just letting you know I don't rely on the Shulchan. Okay, by way of just demonstrating for you that this notion that the Shulchan Aruch was authoritative was by no means immediate. It wasn't like he published the thing in the 1560s, the world changed and everyone put away all the other books and said, okay, pull out the Shulchan Aruch and tell me what he says. In his lifetime and after his lifetime and well into the 17th century, there's ongoing opposition to the notion of codification and specifically to the use of the Shulchan Aruch as a final authority. Okay, the Maharsha writes the following in source number 7. He says, "V'doras halalu osan shemur malachim mitoch Shulchan Aruch ba'areihem ein yodin tam ha'inyan shekol davar im lo yidaktek mitchila b'dvar mitoch haTalmud shu shimush talmidei chachamim v'taus nafal b'rasam ba'areihem bichlal mavle olam v'yesh ligor b'hem." Okay, so this is a stunning rebuke of people who use the Shulchan Aruch. He says it's a scourge in our generation. People are using the Shulchan Aruch and they're paskening halacha directly from the Shulchan Aruch. And the problem is they don't really know what they're talking about because they haven't gone through the sugya and they don't know the Talmudic discussion. He says the bread and butter of any Talmud Chacham is the Talmud. You can't abandon the Talmud. You might be making a terrible mistake you'll never even know, because right, it's like you never went to medical school, to use a very loose analogy, and you go to WebMD and you look up, oh, I have these 3 symptoms, it must be. That's ridiculous, right? Nobody would practice medicine that way. You can't practice halacha based on a code. You need to know the sources. You need to do the research. Shortcuts in halacha don't work. I'll just share with you an excerpt from Leon de Modena, who was a fascinating person who requires a lot of discussion for another context. But he's living in the generations after the publication of the Shulhan Arukh, and in Italy. And I'll just give you one excerpt from the book "The Scandal of Kabbalah" by Yaakov Dweck. He writes that after the printing of the Shulhan Arukh, this is source 8. After the printing of the Shulhan Arukh, my ears heard from an ignoramus, someone beloved to me, peace be upon him, who used to say, "When I have the Shulhan Arukh underneath the joints of my arms, I do not need a single one of you rabbis." So there's opposition to the Shulchan Aruch because you can't just have a code. What about the Talmud? But there's another voice of opposition that says you can't just have the Shulchan Aruch, because if you have the Shulchan Aruch, well, you'll make rabbis obsolete. I could just be a layperson and pull the Shulchan Aruch off the shelf, and the chicken was missing the bone, and what to do? Is it kosher? I'll look it up and I'll know the answer. So I don't need to take the chicken to the rabbi to tell me if it's kosher or not, right? So you did away with the need for the very notion of rabbinic decision making, and that itself is reason enough to oppose the idea of a shulchan.
What about the Beis Yosef?
What do you mean? What about the Beis Yosef?
In other words, what would these fellows who are objecting to a very trimmed down Shulchan Aruch say to the Beis Yosef, who obviously went through all the sources and went through in depth?
Yeah. So that's a great point. So the vehemence of opposition to the Shulchan Aruch doesn't necessarily spill over to the Beis Yosef. I don't think the Yam Shel Shlomo, I don't think Reb Shlomo Lurie would have any objection to someone who sat with the Beis Yosef and went through all the sugya based on the sources that the Beis Yosef compiled. Right. I think those who opposed the Shulchan Aruch, some of whom I just mentioned, right, would be thrilled to know that someone went through the depth and breadth of the learning assembled in the Beis Yosef. So I don't think the objection was to the Beis Yosef. That's an amazing project. The principal objection comes to this notion that you could just snap your fingers and know the conclusion to the halachic process by looking up, page 406, section 2, paragraph 7. Okay, so let me now pivot and transition to this question, which I think now is even harder to answer. Recognizing that there wasn't this instantaneous, moment in the course of Jewish history in the 1560s, the Shulchan Aruch appeared and it became a sensation. Yes, it became a sensation, but with a ton of opposition. So how do we overcome that opposition over the course of history such that when we arrive in 2023, right, there's no Maharshal at the tip of our tongues, and there's no Lavush at the tip of our tongues. It's just the Shulchan Aruch at the tip of our tongues. I'm exaggerating a little. I'm saying it's not the be-all and end-all of the conversation, but it is so singularly important and so singularly influential in the halachic conversation, despite all of this protracted opposition by major rabbinic personalities over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries.
Before you do that, can I ask a question?
Please.
Before Rabbi Karo, weren't they paskening the way they always had done? And why all of a sudden was there the need for something new and Reader Digest like? It had been like that since the the composition of the Talmud. And now there's this big dispute over this new revolutionary approach. But they had always been doing it that way. So, and had there been problems doing it that way? What was the reason for the need to feel this, to do this?
Yes, that's a great question, which we addressed a little in the first session. So there's a couple pieces to that answer. One of them, and maybe the principal answer to that question, has to do with dispersion. So this is an age and a time where Jewish communities are in flux, right? The Sephardic Jewish community at the end of the 15th century is scattered and again in a state of diaspora, thanks to the Iberian expulsions at the end of the century. And Ashkenazic Jews are dealing with their own internal displacement. So there's this sense that we can't just march on with, we'll just do what we always did in our local community. We don't have a local community. We just got to a new community and they have their own practice. We need something which is going to guide us because the old guides are not as available. We've been displaced. Rabbi Yosef Karo adds another dimension to this conversation. He says it's the age of print. Everyone is putting out a pamphlet called Hilchos Shchita. Here's how to do it. And he says they're bad. They're ill-conceived and they're poorly researched and they're poorly organized. And we need something which is going to combine, consolidate, and make life easier for those interested in the halachic process. So there's more to the discussion, but those are two, at least, of the stated reasons why codification becomes sort of a dominant force at this moment.
Rabbi, also, yes. I mean, this is not a 15th century or 16th century happening. It happened in the 12th century with Rambam. The same discourse about whether it's something that should be done.
Yes, it's a fair point. Meaning, this is not sui generis. This happens from time to time over the course of Jewish history, where someone comes along and says things are too messy, things are too disjointed. We need something which is going to be more organized. And I don't want to be presumptuous, but we need something that's going to be more authoritative. Okay. So what I want to share with you are 5 answers to the question of how it is that the Shulchan Aruch became a decisive code of Jewish law. There are 5 very different answers. Maybe some of them you'll find compelling. Maybe some of them you'll find less compelling. But I want to put them all into the mix and share with you why I think each of them has merit. None of them really, maybe with 1 or 2 exceptions, none of the sources that I'm about to share with you were kind of intended on their own to answer this question. I've excerpted them from larger discussions because I believe that they, in one way or another, address the problem that we're trying to solve. So Moses Gaster, who was a rabbi in England and a historian in the 19th century, once wrote the following, and I have it for you in source number 9. Moses Gaster wrote the following. He says, "As the bee gathers from innumerable flowers the sweet honey, so did Rabbi Joseph Karo gather the sweet honey of learning from numberless flowers which have grown in the field of Judah over 1,000 years, often watered with tears and blood." And this is the famous Shulchan Aruch. This, the reason of its unrivaled authority and great reputation. It has saved Judaism from dissensions and schisms. It has reunited the separated members into one body. It has reestablished the threatened unity of worship and entity of law. It will remain as a model of the most perfect, world-embracing code of laws, a code such as no other nation can boast of, a monument of piety and learning, of penetrating intellect, of skill and devotion and everlasting glory. Okay, he wrote this in 1893. We don't really write this way in 2023, as lyrical and as poetic as it may be. But I would argue that Moses Gaster's answer to the question of what made the Shulchan Aruch the authoritative code of Jewish law is one word: merit. I think Moses Gaster would say it was simply the best. And time and history bore this out. And I alluded to this a few moments ago when I said, there were other books in the marketplace competing with the Shulchan Aruch. You could go into the local bookshop in Amsterdam at the end of the 17th century, and there's a Maharshal, and there's a Lavush, and there's a Shulchan Aruch. And the Shulchan Aruchs kept on getting sold out, and everything else kept on gathering dust on the shelf. So, what makes a classic? Why is there Shakespeare in the park and not Marlowe in the park? He was also a great poet and also a great playwright, or any of others Shakespeare's contemporaries. So at some point, the answer is, well, that person rose above the competition because they were just deemed to be the best among their competitors. Okay? And there's certainly something to be said for this argument. It doesn't answer the why, but it reports on the how. Right, the marketplace dictates what becomes celebrated, what becomes principle, what becomes authoritative, and the marketplace decided that this was the best code of Jewish law, and so it is the best code of Jewish law. Second answer I want to share with you comes from an excerpt from a fascinating article called Persecution in the Art of Printing by a contemporary scholar in Israel named Amnon Raz Krukutskin. And I'll share with you the excerpt in source number 10. Amnon Raz Krukutskin notes the following. He says, the Shulchan Aruch embodies many aspects associated with the advent of print, such as unification, distribution, the rise of new codes, new communities of readers, and the standardization of textual traditions and praxis. Karo was an obvious, albeit exceptional, example of a new author who was well aware of the advantages and restrictions of print. The explicit purpose of the book was popularization, namely, to make the law available to both scholars and lay people, and the author was well aware that it would quickly be disseminated throughout the Jewish world and hoped that it would bring unification and consensus. If you study the history of Christianity and you go to a freshman seminar and you learn about the Reformation in the first half of the 16th century, so there'll always be a conversation like, could the Reformation have happened 100 years earlier before the advent of print? And the answer is almost certainly not. And I'm just using that as a loose analogy, but an important analogy from the same basic time period, which is to say, if you're interested, and as we talked about a couple weeks ago, Rabbi Yosef Karo was interested in creating some kind of unified body of law that would be widely accepted, not just in Safed and not just in Palestine and not just in the Ottoman Empire, but in world Jewry writ large. Right? So how could you accomplish that if you're not living in the age of print? It's just this moment in history, right? In the 16th century, where print has, they call the 15th century, if a book is printed in the 15th century, it's called the period of incunabula, right? Like an incubator. It's just printing was at its infancy. And now you get to the 16th century and print is taking off. Like, you know what a book looks like, you know how to publish it, you know how to print it, you know how it's going to be distributed. There's a publishing industry and it's a real thing. It's a new technology and we know how to deploy it. And so the second argument that I want to say about the Shulchan Aruch is that Rabbi Yosef Karo used print to his advantage. He knew about the technology. He deployed the technology, and he made the most of that technology to disseminate his work in a way that, again, just would not have been possible had he lived 100 years earlier. So there's something about the mazel and the timing of the creation of a book like the Shulhan Aruch, which, again, one could not imagine happening at a different epoch in Jewish history. The third answer I want to share with you is perhaps the most theologically extreme, and that's the answer provided by Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz. Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz lived from 1690 to 1764. Maybe another time we'll have an opportunity to talk about the Emden Eibeshitz controversy. There was great controversy in the life of Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, but despite all the controversy that surrounded him during and after his lifetime, his works remain studied in the traditional Beis Medrash, and he was a Gadol BeYisrael in the 18th century. And he once wrote the following as a kind of a reflection on the work of Rabbi Yosef Karo and Rav Moshe Isserlis, the Shulhan Aruch and the Ramah, and I have it for you here in source number 11. Listen to his words. He says, "Kabbalah biyadi, v'chein ra'isi midayanim mumchim." I have a Kabbalah, which means I have a tradition, and I've also heard this from great people. This is my Masorah, and again, he's writing this, circa 1750, almost 200 years after the printing of the Shulchan Aruch. So already by his time, the Shulchan Aruch is canonical. Says, Kevan Sharav Beis Yosef Ramah Shmo Zichrono Achrei Hadeles Ein Lachushlo V'kimu v'kiblu Chachmei Ador Lishmor V'lasos B'chol HaOmer B'matbea HaKatzar Shulchan Aruch V'Agos Ramah. Says, I have this tradition that we follow them. They're the last word. The Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, right? That is decisive. Ulidati, and he says, I just want to reflect on this. Ein safek ki hakol b'ksav biyad Hashem hiskil al yada. This is a stunning formulation. Now, it happens to be Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz was a Kabbalist, but if you read his books, he also makes rational arguments about the halachic discourse. So he says, it seems to me that the authors of the Shulchan Aruch and its glosses, Rabbi Yosef Karo and Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, were writing with Yad Hashem. I'll leave it untranslated for a second. There were questions that were asked of Rabbi Yosef Karo and Moshe Isserlis, deep and penetrating questions, and they always were able to answer those questions. And sweetly and succinctly, they included in such a short work so many different laws. Says, without even knowing what their influence and the authority of these works would be, they generated these works, the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah. Melech Hashemayim Shahaya Alehem. Unwittingly creating like a divinely endowed work. How could it be that someone could create a work that was culled from the entire Torah, sourced from all of the Rishonim and the Achronim, the medieval commentators, the contemporary commentators? Is it possible for them to have accomplished what they accomplished without some form of divine intervention? How could it not be the work of heaven? Rak ruach Hashem nosasa b'kirbam lios l'shonam mechuvan lahalacha b'li kavanas hakosev v'chepetz Hashem biyadam hitzliach. It's only because the Spirit of God was with them that they were guided, again, unwittingly, unconsciously, that they were guided to the language of authority, for it was God's will that their work be successful. So it's a theologically quite complex thing to say. But Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz is saying, you know why the Shulchan Aruch became authoritative? As part of God's plan. There's no way. There's no other way to explain it, right? How could this work that's so encompassing and so far-reaching and so well organized and so well articulated? It's like that. It's just, there's not, in a literal way, he's saying there's not any way rationally on a human level to explain how this happened. The only way I can answer the question of how this work was produced, and I'll say by extension, how this work came to be so authoritative, the only answer to that question is it's part of God's will. Hashem tapped these men, Yosef, Karo, and Rav Moshe Isserlis, to produce this code. Answer number 3. Answer number 4, I excerpt from an article by Professor Elchanan Reiner, who's an unbelievable genius. He doesn't need my haskama, but he's just an amazing scholar, senior scholar in Israel today, and has trained a whole generation of contemporary Israeli scholars. And he has an article, a seminal article called "The Ashkenazi Elite at the Beginning of the Modern Era: Manuscript versus the printed book." And sort of by the by, he explains the role of the Ramah's decision to attach his commentary to the Shulchan Aruch. And I share it with you at some length in source number 12 on your source sheet. Let's look at it together. Answer number 4, how the Shulchan Aruch became authoritative. The book named Shulchan Aruch was written by Joseph Karo, the Sephardi in Safed in the year 1555 to 1563, and first printed Venice, 1565, a good historical overview of what we've talked about. It was not the author's intention to write a major legal code for poskim, the very opposite. Alongside his commentary Beit Yosef on the Arbiturim, in which he laid down up-to-date rules of legal decision and filled in gaps remaining since the completion of the Torah, the last code completed before his time in the 14th century Spain, he had written the Shulchan Aruch as a manual for laymen and students, that is, for the less learned strata of society. Okay? And so writes the Shulchan Aruch in his introduction, that the Shulchan Aruch, contrary to its author's intentions, became the most authoritative legal code of Jewry, is due, now he answers the question, is due to Ramah. How? The edition of Shulchan Aruch printed in Krakow in 1578 to 1580 included glosses by Ramah, which, so he explained in the introduction, were intended to introduce Ashkenazi custom into the work of the Sephardi author, as we talked about. So now the Shulchan Aruch is not just a Sephardic text, but a Sephardic text that's readable by and for Ashkenazim because it includes the glosses of the Ramah. The fact that he wove his comments into the main text as glosses indicates, beside upholding the traditional Ashkenazic attitude to a text, it indicates that the work itself, meant to serve as a textbook for laymen, had been accepted in Ramah's yeshiva at Krakow as a student's reference book. Instead of the Arbiturim, the main text for the study of poskim in the Ashkenazic yeshiva up to Ramah's day. Before the Ramah made his decision to include his glosses in the Shulchan Aruch, if you were a student studying for the rabbinate in Krakow in 1550, so you pulled the Torah off your shelf. That was your Ashkenazic code of law. But because the Ramah included his glosses in the Shulchan Aruch, the whole system changed. Instead of the Arbiturim, the main text for the study of poskim in the Ashkenazic yeshiva up to Ramah's day, he chose to use the new book, which was free of accumulated layers of glosses and emendations, up-to-date and lucid, arranged along the same lines as the old Turim, so that it was easily introduced into the yeshiva curriculum. This was the crucial step in altering the canonical status of the Shulchan Aruch. Thus, the Turim became the second work of the medieval Ashkenazi canon that Ramah had replaced with a new book. Although it is generally accepted that Ramah's glosses were intended to supplement the Sephardi text and adjust it to Ashkenazi usage, his work was actually far more complicated. And this is fascinating. More than just, and again, this updates, the argument that I made last week, more than just introducing Ashkenazi practice at the appropriate place, which is what it seems like he was doing. He, in fact, edited and screened it quite deliberately. His glosses discarded rather than preserve the bulk of the corpus of Ashkenazi customs left over from the Middle Ages. And that's why so many people attack the Ramah. Like, oh, what about the other customs? What about, you spoke for Poland, but what about Germany? Because he incorporated only a small part of the Ashkenazi practice into the Shulchan Aruch, the material that had not entered the Shulchan Aruch gradually disappeared from the consciousness and everyday life of the Ashkenazi community. Ramah thus narrowed the local basis of Ashkenazi halacha and produced a code whose ethnic boundaries were largely blurred. He was therefore largely responsible for the canonization of Ashkenazi practice, having transferred it from the oral realm and placed it on a level with the written halacha. The fourth answer to the question of how the Shulchan Aruch became the authoritative code of Jewish law, according to Elchanan Reiner, it's the first answer. But for us, the fourth answer is it was the Ramah's decision to attach his glosses to the Shulchan Aruch. Again, remember, the Rabbi Yosef Karo was the Gadol Hadur in Safed, and Rav Moshe Isserles was a much younger Gadol Hadur of Ashkenazi Jews in Krakow. The fact that Rav Moshe Isserles made this decision elevated and canonized the Shulchan Aruch for Ashkenazi Jewry. And what an important point that Elchanan Reiner makes about the blurring of lines, right? So you might stop and notice the different font, and you pick up the Shulchan Aruch, and that's where the Shulchan Aruch ends, and that's where the Ramah begins. But you're reading them in the same sentence. You're reading them in the same paragraph. And in fact, I didn't put it on the source sheet, but in the 18th and 19th centuries, the poskim often refer to the authors in plural of the Shulchan Aruch, the Balei HaShulchan Aruch, meaning Rabbi Yosef Karo and Rav Moshe Isserles. It just became one text. It became one book. It was a book written by Rav Yosef Karo in Safed. It was glosses written by Rav Moshe Isserles in Krakow. And yet, the fact that they were printed, the fact that they were published together on the same page, in the same paragraph, right, the lines got blurred and it became one text available to the Sephardim, available to the Ashkenazim, and it became canonical. Fifth and final answer that I'll share with you before I attempt to tie things together and give a little a summation is a recollection or a testimony by the Chida. Reb Chaim Yosef David Azulai was an amazing historical figure. He was a Sephardic rabbi from Palestine, who was a massive Talmud Chacham, but was also dispatched to collect money for the ever indigent Jews of the Sephardic Palestinian community in the 18th century. And so he went around the Ottoman Empire and Europe collecting. And part of what makes the Chida so extraordinary is that he kept a diary. And we have it. It's called Magal Tov. It's for another discussion. There's new editions actually just came out in the past year or two, where he tells you about all the extraordinary people that he met. And some communities treated him well, and some communities treated him less well. And he's brutally honest. And he reports on every day of his trip. He actually made 3 such journeys over the course of the 18th century. He also wrote a book called Shem HaGedolim, which is a kind of encyclopedia of rabbis and their books. There's 2 sections. You could look up the name of a rabbi, and he gives you a little biography and who they were, and if he met them, and when they lived, and what they wrote. And you could look up the books. This is sometimes we have the book in print. Sometimes there's only a manuscript. I actually saw a copy of the book. There's manuscripts that I found by the same author. an amazing man, an amazing collection of work. So in his book, The Shem HaGedolim, source number 13 on your sheets, the Chida Arukh Chaim Yosef David Azulai writes the following. He says, "V'da shekibalti miziknei Torah v'yira, shesham'o mipeh kadosh harav hagadol ir v'kadish marenu harav Reb Chaim Abulafia, shekabala biyado." So he's writing this, circa 1750. And he says he has a Kabbalah, he has a tradition from his teachers who have it on good authority, from Reb Chaim Abulafia, who had it on good authority, the following. There's an oral tradition that this is what happened. Shal klal maran b'psak halacha lelechas achrei shlosha amudei beis Yisrael, harif v'rambam v'arash v'chulei. This idea, which again was quite revolutionary, the notion that the Beis Yosef and the Shulhan Aruch would decide halacha based on a majority between and among the three pillars of the halachic world, the Rif, the Rambam, and the Rush. The idea that notion, paskening 2 out of 3, that the Shulhan Aruch popularized, that idea was accepted. Hiskimu karov l'masayim rabbanim b'dura. That idea was accepted by 200 rabbis, maybe the students of, maybe the contemporaries of Rabbi Yosef Karo. V'chein haya margala bepumei deharav haniskar ki kol shiyasek ipsak maran hinehu osek kemasayim rabbanim. And Reb Chaim Abulafia used to say, if you paskin like the Shulchan Aruch, you're not just paskening like Rabbi Yosef Karo. You're actually paskening like the 200 rabbis of 16th century Safed who voted to accept this procedure that Rabbi Yosef Karo popularized. Now, I don't know if anybody gave them, an alternative. I don't know if they sat there and they collected votes and they took account. Who knows if there were some objectors? But the tradition is that there were 200 concurring rabbis. The fifth answer to our question of how Rabbi Yosef Karo became accepted is they voted on it. There was a communal decision, right? And 200 is a big number. Who knows who they were and where they were? But if there's 200 people, speaking as a voice of authority for XYZ communities, well, that goes a heck of a long way. And the legend is, I mentioned this in passing in one of our earlier classes. I mentioned just the fact that the Shulchan Aruch is often referred to as Maran, which is a funny formulation, not Morenu, not Harav, but Maran. And what is Maran? The legend is that it's an acronym, and it stands for Mimatayim Rabbanim Nismach. That there were 200 rabbis who actually consented, who actually gave their authority to Rabbi Yosef Karo's decision-making process, hence granting the canonical status to his book, the Shulchan Aruch. 5 answers to the question, how is it that the Shulchan Aruch became such an authoritative text for the Jewish people over the course of the last 500 years? Answer number 1, maybe it was just the best. Answer number 2, it never could have happened if not for the advent of the printing press, which allowed the author of the Shulchan Aruch to disseminate and popularize his book in a way that would have been impossible in an age of manuscript. Answer number 3, it was the hand of Hashem. There is no way to account for how this happened. The only way to explain it is by saying Hashem must have made it so. Answer number 4, it was the inclusion of the Ramah, the decision to append his glosses, the decision by Moshe Isserlis to append his glosses to the work of the Shulchan Aruch that made the text canonical, not just for Sephardim, but for Ashkenazim, and thereby the entirety of the Jewish world. Answer number 5, there was a kind of democratic process whereby contemporaries of Rabbi Yosef Karo voted and decided by consensus that this would be the authoritative text of the Jewish people. Now, there's very little to disprove any of these theories, and I actually think each one can be complementary. Merit, timing, luck, destiny, these are all important factors in this story. But what an extraordinary story it is to create a book that would be as relevant in its own time as it would be some 500 years later. And what's more, it generated generations of commentaries that both made it more canonical, to the extent that such a formulation is legitimate, and at the same time expanded its scope by incorporating in every generation the newest application of its laws. And so the book was never dated, because in every generation there was a new commentary to account for new technologies and new circumstances and new questions, so that the Shulchan Aruch continued to remain the basis for the halachic discussion, whatever generation we find ourselves. I'm going to stop here and invite anyone to offer comments or questions, but I thank you for joining us over these past weeks for this series. It's been a pleasure to have the opportunity to learn Torah with you, and I hope we'll have more opportunities to learn together in the very near future.
Thank you. It's very interesting.
So I have two things to say.
Please.
Number one is that a majority of the Jewish population throughout the world are people who are not scholars. Therefore, the majority are going to vote by what's the easiest thing to get their answers. So we're lucky that there was print. We're lucky that it was completed by the Ramah and by Rabbi Yosef. But I think it's if you wrote you wrote it on a postcard and sent it around to everybody, and this is the answer. You don't have to look it up. We'd all use it. Okay. Second thing, if you read the Shulchan Aruch, do you read from the present backwards, or do you read from the past forwards?
Great question. So I would say that that you start with the Shulchan Aruch and you read forward. Meaning, let's say a posek is interested in knowing whether or not you can ride a bike on Yontif. I'm just making this up. Okay, so presumably there weren't bikes in 16th century.
If you could ride a car, and you could ride it up to date.
Right. Whatever new question came up that wasn't on the minds of anyone in the 16th century, they never could have imagined it. So you start with, it depends who you are. If you're really serious, you start with the Talmudic discussion. But at the very least, right, you're going to open up the Shulchan Aruch and you're gonna try to identify the path of the halachic process, right, which is going to start with, well, here's the particular issue that exists on Shabbos that may be problematic. And here's what the poskim said about it in the 16th century, and then the 17th and the 18th century. And now you have a foundation. Now you've done the spade work to figure out how to build the halachic argument for the contemporary moment. So if you're really serious about the halachic process, right, you're going to see the whole arc, right, from the Shulchan Aruch all the way to 2023. And if it's a really contemporary issue, what if somebody orders chametz on Amazon and it gets delivered on, right? It just came up with that. How new is that issue? So if you're really serious about the process, you'll see the whole arc of the halachic discourse from the Shulchan Aruch to the present.
Thank you.
Can I ask one quick question?
Sure. I just see a couple quick questions in the chat. So let me jump to those, and then I'll be happy to take any further questions. So haven't we arrived at the same stage of confusion and the multiplicity of understandings in Jewish life as existed in the 1500s with the advent of electronic media? paralleling the effects of the printing revolution amongst other complex causes. Is there anyone or any group at present who might be involved in producing a Shulchan Aruch for our times? So that is a great question and a great comment. And the answer is sort of yes, meaning what's happening now in the 21st century, given the ease by which people can communicate with new technologies. So there are a lot of parallels with the print revolution, and in some ways, it's a lot of the same conversation. What happens when you democratize knowledge, and now anybody can access virtually anything in a matter of seconds. So it creates this tension, because on the one hand, how wonderful, and we're thrilled that all that information is accessible and out there. On the other, as you say, it does create a multiplicity of voices, which can be cacophonous for the layperson. It's like, well, I just Googled what happens if I forgot to say Ya'aleh V'Yavo and Rosh Chodesh. I got 17 different answers. How do I get the answer? So I don't know of any contemporary project to create a new Shulchan Aruch, but like any new technology, and again, in the grand scheme of things, it's all new. The internet is a generation old. The social media is even younger than that. So we're grappling with it, in this moment. As a historian, it's hard to say how it'll all shake out, but there are lessons to be learned, because this is not a new story. Meaning these were the exact same issues in parallel, that we were dealing with when the print revolution hit us in the 15th and 16th centuries.
More relevantly, today we could go on and go to Chat GPT and ask the question and see what we get back. It'd be the answer.
Yes, artificial intelligence is a new frontier, and I've actually used Chat GPT a few times just to get a feel for it. It's unbelievable, right? And again, there's always going to be something that you're missing when you don't have the human touch. But what a resource! What a resource! Is it possible the fact that the Mishnah Berurah was written as glosses on the Shulchan Aruch explains its predominance over the Aruch HaShulchan, despite the fact that the latter is much easier to read and may be equally authoritative? Also a great question. So I can't say that I know the answer to why it is that the Mishnah Berurah became so popular, certainly in America in the 20th century. But yes, I think the fact that it is appended to the Shulchan Aruch certainly adds to its canonicity. If you just pick up, as you say, the Aruch HaShulchan, which is written as an independent book and doesn't contain the text of the Shulchan Aruch, even though he quotes often from the Shulchan Aruch. So I think the reader feels like he or she might be missing something. Questions from the audience, Eric?
Yeah, I've heard that. I've heard it argued that despite the canonicity of the Shulchan Aruch, that actually many of the things in there have sort of fallen out of Jewish practice and sort of not made it through all the generations, and that like certain mourning customs and things that it actually, I don't know the degree to that. That's what I'm really asking. How much of it really would one look at if we're trying to measure it up against today and say, well, actually it's obsolete here, it's obsolete there. Jewish people have moved on from this or moved on from that. And I'm talking about in the observant, Orthodox setting.
Right.
Is there much of that, or is that really not true?
So it's a great question. Meaning, you're right. There are certain areas of halacha or certain instances in which something may have been written since the Shulchan Aruch that is more accepted or more practiced. I don't think I'm in a position to quantify it. But I would say the following. I would say the Shulchan Aruch still has to be grappled with, even in moments or in circumstances when there are countervailing forces. So as opposed to like Elchanan Reiner was describing, practices that just sort of fell by the wayside because they never got recorded or never got popularized. So there might be stuff that we would never bring up, we would never enter into the halachic conversation. Whereas if it's in the Shulchan Aruch, it is almost by definition going to be a part of the conversation. Someone could say, well, yes, we've moved past it, as you said, or maybe someone has made a stronger argument, or it's not relevant for whatever reason in a particular circumstance, but it can't just be ignored. Any final questions or thoughts?
Are you surprised that the Rambam has made such a comeback even after the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah was printed?
So I don't know if I would use the word comeback in the sense that I don't think the Rambam was ever not popular. Meaning, I think, particularly in the Sephardic world, the Rambam was and remains the cat's meow. And there's no comparable personality, that you could say the Rambam. And no, it's the Rambam. And even among Ashkenazim, he's such a person of towering importance. I don't know if I could point to a generation where that wasn't the case. So we're going to stop here, but once again, thank you to everyone for participating. Wonderful to have the opportunity to do this learning with you, and I hope we'll have another opportunity to learn together again soon. Stay well.
You are a wonderful teacher. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi, and Chodesh Tov.
Kodesh Tov, Kodesh Tov.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. I've learned so much. And thank you very much. All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you and Chodesh Tov.
Kodesh Tov.